Thanks a lot for joining us on Newsnight this evening.
Thank you for having me.
This question, how much campaigning is actually acceptable campaigning? And can campaigning actually happen in the workplace? I mean, will it not marginalize people?
Well, it has that risk, and it has proven in the past it tends to polarize the working environment, but it's not prohibited unless the employer has a rule prohibiting campaigning. But in essence, it depends on the nature of campaigning. If one was to look at something like someone wanting to hold a political meeting in the workplace, he will need the explicit consent of the employer to do such. But if one was to come wearing their political party regalia, for example, that's passive campaigning. You will not need the explicit consent of your employer unless there is a rule, an express rule in the workplace that prohibits.
Yeah, but then I'm just thinking of code of conduct, even around dress codes, right? You speak about passive campaigning, but every single company has got its own code of conduct in terms of how you should dress, shirt, look smart. Women are supposed to look a certain way. Men are supposed to have certain, clothing on. If one now starts wearing political party T-shirts, does that not go against the very same code of conduct, especially where, how to look and how to be presentable in the workplace has actually been instituted by many companies?
Well, it will not necessarily go against the code of conduct unless expressly provided that, expressly prohibited that you should not wear your political regalia. For example, you look at many companies, they will have casual days. So if someone pitches up wearing their golf T-shirt on a casual day, and it happens to be a party political golf T-shirt, you cannot take action against them unless you've told them that we have a rule that prohibits such conduct. And that rule needs to be known by all the employees, so it cannot be known by that employee only. It cannot be exercised in respect of that particular employee only.
Is that even allowed? I mean, I'm just thinking from a company perspective to actually prohibit people from expressing their political alliance or their political affiliation in the workplace without infringing on another individual's right, so to say.
Yes, it is allowed. Yes, to a certain extent it will restrict the individual's right, but employers are entitled to say we want an apolitical working environment. More especially if you look at in industries such as mining, for example, where there's been politically related violence, one can easily justify having such a rule where we say we don't want to be seen to be supporting a particular political party as an employer, nor do we want to be our employees, more especially when you look at senior employees, to be seen to be aligned to a specific political party. So it is a reasonable rule to have in place, but it will need to be enforced to everyone in the same way.
Yeah, and then our members, and I'm just thinking for corporations or medium enterprises, for example, are the very same employees allowed to then, through their trade unions or some form of affiliation, union affiliation, say actually we want this rule scrapped, where we are an apolitical working environment? Or is it because it's a private sector and your employer determines the rights of how to operate within that specific private sector environment that actually you're not allowed to contest that and say, no, hold on, I understand your rules and your code of conduct in terms of apolitical, but because we are unionized and because we've got this expression, would like this specific rule scratched and therefore impose upon the company a rule that says that we can actually be politically affiliated, so if we choose.
Yeah, a workplace by its very nature, it's a ground for contestation. And unions will always make certain demands or challenge certain rules that exist in the workplace. And one cannot say they cannot challenge it. They can challenge such a rule, but they will have to justify as to why they believe that such a rule is unreasonable. But it can be challenged, and it will be a matter for bargaining between the employer and the union. But looking at it from an employer's perspective, one can say you are justified to have such a rule in place, particularly because you want to have a united workforce. You don't want in the workplace to have an ANC, an EFF, or a DA person. You just want to have your workforce.
I mean, you're speaking a little bit about the passive campaigning
Yes.
Versus, the quite overt campaigning in itself. Would you say that there is a minimum amount of campaigning that can take place in the workplace that does not necessarily marginalize the rest of the workforce? Let's say that there is an EFF member, and an ANC, and a DA member, and a UDA member at actually the workplace in itself. If they had to campaign within their own rights themselves, what is the non-fireable, for lack of a better English term, way in which they can campaign to get, their constituents on board and still manage to keep their jobs and still manage to have an effective working environment?
In fact, it happens, I will say, daily through discussions and debates that take place about political affairs in the workplace. That's where people will be advancing their political views and defending their political views as well. So that is a form of campaigning that is happening ordinarily in the workplace day to day. But obviously there are restrictions when such campaigning is now going to be seen as someone being racist in their discussions with fellow colleagues. That can result in them being disciplined. Sexism is one example. That now if your view or the manner in which you're contesting your views come across as you being sexist or racist, then that can now breach the rules and can result in a
Can you be fired for actually campaigning in an environment where it's specifically actually highlighted that it's an apolitical work environment?
It will depend in what fashion were you campaigning. For example, if it was an express, disregard of that particular rule, yes, I will imagine that it might be a serious misconduct. It will depend on the disciplinary code of that particular employer. But in most cases, you might find that someone is not overtly campaigning, but in a passive manner, they were campaigning in a way. One example I can think of, you might be told that you're not allowed to wear a political regalia, but you might have your phone, and the screensaver of your phone might be the colors of your political party or the banner of your political party. So that's sort of like passive campaigning. It's quite difficult to say, will it warrant you being dismissed, more especially if it's your private phone. So there are that grey spaces that one will say they have not been tested yet in the judicial space.
Okay, but just before we close this conversation, in your professional opinion, would you recommend that companies, those who do not necessarily have this a rule that's been quite clearly stipulated that it's an apolitical environment, to start enforcing it? Or, in your suggestion, would you actually recommend that a work environment is a free space where people are able to voice their various political expressions without feeling as though there's a loss of income or that there's a fear of any form of repercussion?
Well, purely maybe looking at it from the lenses of looking at industries or companies where there's multiple unions contesting the workplace, it tends to become disruptive in the workplace, and it tends to take away too much time where you're now managing all these dynamics that are presented by such an environment. So from where I'm sitting, I think an apolitical environment is the best environment, but that does not apply to all industries or all sectors. But in the main or in the general, I will say an apolitical environment, it's one which will cause less disruptions in the workplace.
Thabang, we're going to leave our conversation there, but thank you so much for joining us
and
really
so
sharing some insightful notice there. It's going to be quite interesting ahead of the actual elections themselves.